2. Curled in a low peach limb, the old man watched the mid-morning sun blinding on the squat metal tank that topped the mountain. He had found some peaches, although the orchard went to ruin 20 years before when the fruit had come so thick and no one to pick it, that at night the overborne branches cracking sounded in the valley like distant storms raging. The old man remembered it that way, for he was a lover of storms. The tank was on high legs and had a fence around it with red signs that he had been pondering for some time, not just today. From time to time he sliced a bite from one of his peaches. They were small and hard, but he had good teeth. He propped one foot up in the limb with him and fell to stropping the knife slowly on the smooth, worn toe of his boot. Then he wet a patch of hair on his arm and tested the blade. Satisfied, he reached for another peach and began peeling it. When he had finished this one, he wiped the blade of the knife on his cuff, folded and pocketed it, passed a handful of loose sleeve across his mouth. Then he got down from his limb and started up through the wreckage of the orchard, threading his way among the old gray limbs and stopping to look out over the valley now and again, at the black corded fields and the roofs winking in the sun. When he came out on the road, he turned down to the right, his brogans making small padding sounds in the red dust, his huge knobby-kneed trousers rolling and moiling about him urgently, as if invested with a will and purpose of their own. This was the orchard road, red and quiet in the early sun, winding from the mountain spine with apple trees here along the road and shading it, gnarled and bitten trees yet retaining still a kept look and no weeds growing where they grew. Farther up was a side road that went off among the trees, shade-dappled, grass fine as hair in the ruts. It went to the spray pit, a concrete tank set in the ground that had once been used to mix insecticide. These 6 years past it had served as a crypt, which the old man kept and guarded. Passing it now, he remembered how he had been coming up from the hollow with a gallon bucket when a boy and a girl, neither much more than waist-high to him, had rounded the curve. They stopped when they saw him, and it took him a while coming toward them with his pail to see that they were scared, huge-eyed and winded with running. They looked ready to bolt, so he smiled, said howdy to them, that it was a pretty day. And them there in the road, balanced and poised for flight like two wild things, the little girl's legs brightly veined with briar scratches, and both their mouths blue with berry stain. As he came past, she began to whimper, and the boy, holding her hand, jerked at her to be still, he standing very straight in his overall pants and striped jersey. They edged to the side of the road and turned, watching him go by. He started past, then half-turned and said, "You uns find where the good berries is at?" The boy looked up at him just as though he hadn't been watching him all the time, and said something which cracked in his voice and which the old man couldn't make out. The girl gave up and wailed openly. So he said, "Well, now, what's wrong with little sister? Are you all right, honey? Did you uns lose your berry bucket?" He talked to them like that. After a while, the boy began to blubber too a little and was telling him about back in the pit. For a few minutes he couldn't figure out what was the pit, and then it came to him, and he said, "Well, come on and show me. I reckon it ain't all this bad, whatever it is." So they started up the road, although it was pretty plain they didn't want to go. And when they turned down the road to the spray pit, the boy stopped, still holding the little girl's hand and not crying anymore, but just watching the man. He said he didn't want to go, but for him, the old man, to go on and see. So he told them to wait right there, that it wasn't nothing. He saw the berry pails first. One of them turned over, and the blackberries spilled out in the grass. A few feet beyond was the concrete pit, and even before he got to it, he caught a trace of odor, sour, a little like bad milk. He stepped onto the cracked rim of the pit and looked down into the water, the furred green top of it quiet and touched with light. Sticks and brush poked up at one corner. The smell was stronger, but other than that, there was nothing. He walked along the edge of the pit. Down the slope among the apples, some jays were screaming and flashing in the trees. The morning was well on, and it was getting warm. He walked halfway round, watching his step along the narrow, sandy concrete. Coming back, he glanced down at the water again. The thing seemed to leap at him, the green face leering and coming up through the loosened, rotting water, with eyeless sockets and green, fleshless grin, the hair dark and ebbing like seaweed. He tottered for a moment on the brink of the pit, and then staggered off with a low groan and locked his arms about a tree, trying to fight down the coiling in his stomach. He didn't go back to look again. He got the berry pails and went back to the road, but the children weren't there, and he couldn't think how to call them. After a while he called out, "Hey, I got your berry buckets." Some wind turned the apple leaves, shadow of a buzzard skated on the road and broke up in the fencing of briars. They were gone. He walked up the road away, then back down, but there was no trace of them. 3 days later, when he came back, it was still there. No one had come. With his pocket knife, he cut a small cedar tree with which to put it from sight. It was still there, what of it had weathered the seasons and years. He went on along the road, an old man peddling the scorched dust. The sun was high now, all the green of the morning shot with sunlight, plankton awash in a sea of gold. Even late spring had dried nothing but the dust in the road, and the foliage that overhung either side had not yet assumed its summer coat of red talc. In the early quiet, all sounds were clear and equidistant. A dog barking out in the valley, high thin whistle of a soaring hawk, a lizard scuttling dead leaves at the roadside. A sumac would turn and dip in sudden wind with a faint whish. In the woods, a thrush, water-voiced. The old man took a side path that led along a spur of the mountain, cutting a spider stick as he went to clear the way where huge nets were strung tree to tree, across the path dew-laden and glinting like strands of drawn glass, bringing them down with a sticky whisper, while the spiders fled over the wrecked and dangling floss. He came out on a high bald knoll that looked over the valley, and he stopped here and studied it as a man might cresting a hill and seeing a strange landscape for the first time. Pines and cedars in a swath of dark green piled down the mountain to the left and ceased again where the road cut through. Beyond that, a field and a log hog pen, the shakes spilling down the broken roof, looking like some diminutive settler's cabin in ruins. Through the leaves of the hardwoods, he could see the zinc-colored roof of the church, faintly coruscant, and a patch of boarded siding weathered the paper gray of a wasp nest. And far in the distance, the long purple welts of the Great Smokies. If I was a younger man, he told himself, I would move to them mountains. I would find me a Clearwater branch and build me a log house with a fireplace. And my bees would make Black Mountain honey. And I wouldn't care for no man. He started down the steep incline. Then I wouldn't be unneighborly, neither, he added. The path followed along the south face of the mountain and came out on the pike. A dirt road dropped off into a steep hollow to the left. The old man went this way, down under the wooded slope where water dripped and it was cool. Half a mile farther, and the road turned up a hill, emerging from the woods to poke through a cornfield, where a brace of doves flushed out and fared away to the creek on whistling wings. Beyond the field and set back up from the road was a small board shack with the laths curling out like hair awry, bleached to a metal gray. It was to this place that the man came, carrying the stick across his shoulders now, as one might carry a yoke of water buckets, his hands flapping idly. The hillside in front of the house was littered with all manner of cast-off things, barrel hoops, a broken axe head, fragments of chicken wire, a chipped crock, small antiquated items impacted in the mud. There was a black hog kettle which he didn't use anymore. It was flecked with rust. The porch was shy the first step, and he had to climb up, using his stick for support. The front of the house, in the shade under the porch roof, was green with fungus, and the old man sat wearily on the floor and leaned back against it, stretched his legs out flat, and opened his collar. It was damp and cool. The house faced to the north, with a slope of trees behind it, and snow lay in his yard longer than in most places. In spring, the mountain went violent green, billowing low under the sky. It never came slowly. One morning it would just suddenly be there, and the air rank with the smell of it. The old man sniffed the rich earth odors, remembering other springs, other years. He wondered vaguely how people remembered smells, not like something you see. He could still remember the odor of muskrat castor, and he hadn't smelled it for 40 years. He could even remember the first time he had smelled that peculiar sweet odor, coming down Short Creek one morning a lot more years ago than 40, the cottonwoods white and cold-looking, and the creek smoking. Early in the spring it was, toward the close of the trapping season, and he had caught an old bull rat with orange fur, the size of a house cat. The air was thick with the scent of musk, and had reminded him then of something else, but he could never think what. He dozed, slept for a long time. Late in the afternoon, clouds began to pile up in the gap of the mountain, and a fresh breeze came past the corner of the porch to rock gently the gourds swung from the eaves. He woke before the rain started. The breeze had cooled and cooled, fanning his face and the beads of sweat on his forehead. He sat up and rubbed his neck. A pair of mockingbirds were pinwheeling through the high limbs of the maples, were still. And then, arriving as if surprised themselves in the green-gold heat of the afternoon, the first drops of rain splattered dark on the packed mud below the house. A flat shade undulated across the yard, the road, and climbed the mountain face with an illusion of sudden haste. The rain increased, growing in the distance with the wind and bleaching the trees beyond the creek lime silver. The old man watched the rain advance across the fields, the grass jerking under it, the stones in the road going black, and then the mud in the yard. A gust of spray wet his cheek, and he could hear the roof shakes dancing. When the one gutter pipe wired to the porch roof overflowed, the water fell in a single translucent fan, and the landscape bleared and weaved. The rain splashed in until there was a dark border about the porch. He took out his tobacco and rolled a cigarette with trembling hands, neat and perfect. The wind had gone, and he sat back with his head against the green plankings and watched the smoke standing in the air under the dampness and very blue. After a while, the rain began to slacken, and it was darkening, the sky above the mountain black but for a thin reef of failing gray. And then that was gone, and it was night, staccato with lightning in the distance. The old man began to feel a chill and was ready to go in, when something cracked on the mountain, and he looked up in time to see the domed metal tank on the peak illuminated, quivering in a wild aureole of light. There was a sound like fingernails on slate, and the old man shivered and blinked his eyes, the image burning white-hot in the lenses for another moment. And when he looked again, it was gone, and he stood in darkness with the sound of the rain slipping through the trees, and a thin trickle of water coming off the roof somewhere to spatter in a puddle below. He waggled his hand in front of his face and couldn't even see it. He stood up and batted his eyes. Far back beyond the mountain, a thin wire of lightning glowed briefly. Corner post and porch began to materialize slowly out of the murk, and he could see the hound when it loomed up over the edge of the porch, snuffling, ears flapping and collar jingling as he shook the rain from his reeking hide. He came up, toenails clicking on the planks, and snuffed at the old man's trousers. "Where you been, old dog?" the old man said. The dog began to rub against his leg, and the old man pushed him away with his foot, saying, "Go on, Scout." Scout moved over against the house and settled. The man rubbed the back of his neck, stretched, and went in. The house was musty, dank, and cellar-like. He felt his way to the corner table and lit a coal-oil lamp, the ratty furniture leaping out from the shadows in the yellow light. He went into the kitchen and lit the lamp there, took down a plate of beans and a pan of dry cornbread from the warmer over the stove. He sat at the table and ate them cold, and when he had finished, went outside with a handful of biscuits and threw them to the dog. The rain had almost stopped. The hound bolted down the biscuits and looked up after him. The screen door banged to. The square of light on the porch floor narrowed and went out with the click of the latch. The old man did not appear again. The dog lowered his head on his paws and peered out at the night with wrinkled and sorrowing eyes. Cats troubled the old man's dreams, and he did not sleep well anymore. He feared their coming in the night to suck his meager breath. Once he woke and found one looking in the window at him, watching him as he slept. For a while he had kept the shotgun loaded and lying on the floor beside the bed, but now he only lay there and listened for them. Very often they would not start until late, and he would still be awake, his ears ringing slightly from having listened so long. Then would come a thin, quavering yowl from some dark hollow on the mountain. He had used to trot to the window and peer out at the hills, at the silhouette of pines in the low saddle above Forked Creek, like a mammoth cathedral gothically spired. Now he only lay in his gray covers and listened. He did not sleep much at night, and he was sore and bone-worn from napping in chairs, against logs and trees, sprawled on the porch. When he was a boy in Tuckaleechee, there was a colored woman lived in a shack there who had been a slave. She came there because, as she said, there weren't any other niggers, and because she felt the movements and significations there. She wore a sack of hellebore at her neck, and once he had seen her on the road and hadn't been afraid of her, as he was very young then. So she put 3 drops of milfoil on the back of his tongue and chanted over him so that he would have vision. She told him that the night mountains were walked by wampus cats, with great burning eyes which left no track even in snow, although you could hear them screaming plain enough of summer evenings. "Ain't no sign with wampus cats," she told him. "But if you has the vision, you can read where common folks ain't able." He related this to his mother, and she held the cross of Jesus against his forehead and prayed long and fervently. The old man lay on his back, listening to the heart surge under his rib cage, his breath weaning slow and even. In the fall before this past winter, he had come awake one night and seen it for the second time, black in the paler square of the window, a white mark on its face like an inverted gull wing. and the window frame went all black, and the room was filling up, the white mark looming and growing. He reached down and seized the shotgun by the barrel, spun it around and thumbed the hammer and let it fall. The room erupted. He remembered the orange spit of flame from the muzzle and the sharp smell of burnt powder, that his ears were singing and his arm hurt where the butt came back against it. He got up and stumbled to the table, dragging the gun by its warm barrel, found and struck a match and got the lantern lit. Then he went to the window, the light flickering thin shadows up the wall, playing to the low ceiling and whitening the spider webs. He held the lamp up. Above the window, the boards were blasted and splintered clean and honey-colored. He didn't keep the shotgun by the bed anymore, but over in the corner behind the table. The old man lay awake a long time. Once he thought he heard a cry faintly beyond the creek and the field, but he wasn't sure. A car passed on the road, and he wondered about that. But then he dozed, and the crickets had already stopped. Deep hole between her neck cords, smoke blue. Laddered bone shapes under the paper skin like rows of welts descending into the bosom of her dress. Eyes lowered to her work, blink when she swallows like a toad's. Lids wrinkled like walnut hulls. Her grizzled hair gathered tight, a helmet of zinc wire. Softly rocking. A looping drape of skirt slung in a curtain fold down the side of the chair swept softly at the floor. She sat before the barren fireplace, stitching buttonholes in a shirt of woolen mill ends. From out his scrolled and gilded frame, Captain Kenneth Ratner, fleshy of face and rakish in an overseas cap abutting upon his right eyebrow, the double-barrel insignia wreathed in light, soldier, father, ghost, eyed them. With the lamps aligned, one on either side, she had a ritualistic look, a nun at beads, perhaps. Later, he watched from the kitchen lean-to, because it had a tin roof and the wind had come up now, and was blowing the rain across it with long, ripping sounds like silk tearing. He turned the pages of his magazine, but he had read it so much that he scarcely looked at the pages anymore. Mostly, he watched how the lamp flame quivered and the polished work that bound the stove, burnt to peacock colors of bronze and copper, violet blue, changed patterns, ran to whorls and flame points. He waved his hand over the glass, and the blue canisters above the stove bowed. In the kitchen, the man on the mantel couldn't watch him any more either. After a while, he put down the magazine and turned around in the chair, sat with his elbows propped on the back, and watched out the window for lightning. Thin cracks of it far back over Winkle Hollow, like heat lightning. There was no thunder, only the rain and wind. The boy thought he could remember his father, or perhaps only his mother telling about him. He remembered a man, his father, or just some other man, he was no longer sure. His father didn't come back after they moved from Maryville. He remembered that, the moving. It was a house of logs, hand-squared and chinked with clay, the heavy rafters in the loft pinned with wooden pegs. There had been a loom in the loft, but it had since been burned piece by piece for kindling. It was a huge affair of rough-cut wood that under the dust had retained even then a yellow newness. The rafters still looked that way. In the summer, wasps nested over the boards, using the auger holes where dowels had shrunk in some old dry weather, and fallen to the floor to emerge out into the hot loft and drone past his bed to the window, where a corner of glass was gone, and so out into the sunlight. There had been mud dauber nests stacked up the wide planks, too, but his mother had raked them all down one day, and aside from the wasps, there were only the borers and woodworms, which he never saw but knew by the soft cones of wood dust that gathered on the floor, the top log beneath the eaves, or trailed down upon the cobwebs, heavy yellow sheets of them, opaque with dust and thick as muslin. The house was tall and severe, with few windows. Some supposed it to be the oldest house in the county. It was roofed with shakes, and they seemed the only part of it not impervious to weather and time, for they were blackened and split. And now, curling in their ruin, they seemed victims of a long-ago fire, which the house had somehow escaped altogether, for it was sound and the logs were finely checked and seasoned. They sagged and bellied and seemed supported only by the chimneys of clay and river rock at either end. But the house was strong and settled, and no wind could bring a creak from it. They paid no tax on it, for it did not exist in the county courthouse records, nor on the land, for they did not own it. They paid no rent on either house or land, as claimants to either or both properties were non-existent indeed as the house itself. They paid Oliver Henderson, who brought water to them 3 times a week on his milk route. The well hidden in the weeds and Johnson grass that burgeoned rankly in the yard had long shed its wall of rocks, and they were piled in the dry bottom in layers between which rested, in chance interment, the bones of rabbits, possums, cats, and other various and luckless quadrupeds. He didn't know that, but only guessed because he had found a young rabbit in the well one spring and was afraid to climb down after it. He brought green things to it every day and dropped them in, and then one day he fluttered a handful of garden lettuce down the hole, and he remembered how some of the leaves fell across it and it didn't move. He went away, and he could see for a long time the rabbit down in the bottom of the well among the rocks with the lettuce over it. She had finished now and put one lamp on the mantel and was looking at it with the shirt in her hand held up against her. She stood that way for a while, and then she turned and saw him watching her over his shoulder, each of them touched with light and the space between them through the narrow door dark. He couldn't see her eyes, and he made out that he was looking at something else, and finally turned back to the window and the rain. "Boy," she said. "Yes'm." "You get to bed." "Yes'm," he said again. He did not move. "Your bed ain't got wet, is it?" "No, ma'am." It would be wet, always was, when it rained, even if it didn't blow. It was musty and smelled good then, and cool enough for the blanket. This summer, he had moved to the porch off the kitchen, carrying his bed down one Sunday evening while she was at church, and in it by the time she got back, breathing deeply when she stopped at the door on her way in. Then he could hear her at the dishes in the kitchen humming to herself, and she never said anything about it, except she made him carry out the 2 boxes of bottles and cans he had evicted from the corner. The lean-to porch was screened in from waist-high up. After he was in bed a while, he could see even the acorns in the yard oaks. Some nights a tall, gaunt hound came and peered in the screen door at him, and he would speak to it, it standing there high-shouldered and flat-looking, not moving. And then it would be gone, and he could hear its feet padding off through the yard and the clink of its collar. He pulled the bed out from the corner, turned back the spread, and felt the pillow. Then he turned it over and took the blanket from under his arm and put it on the bed and got in. That was the last night of that summer. He fell asleep to the water and metal sounds of the rain runneling over the tin and sluicing through the gutter pipe, the rapid slash of it in a gust of wind, and the fine mist spraying his face through the bellying screen. The oaks stirred restlessly, low admonitions. Shh. In the morning the rain had stopped, and there was a chill in the air and smoke. He smiled at that, for he was waiting, and weathers and seasons were his timepiece now. There were still warm days, but that didn't matter to him. Jays were in the black oaks mornings, and the grackles had come back, great flocks of them bending the trees, their feathers glinting dark metal colors, and their calls harshly musical, like a rusty swing. Or they would be on the ground, the yard rolling blackly with them, and he would run out and pop his hands once and see them explode sunward, a flapping, shrieking horde bearing leaves and debris into the air on the updraft of their wings. The first weeks of September went, and the weather held and no frost. The veins were coming up in his arms, and he would press them and then raise his fist and feel the blood in the soft tubes. He was pushing time now, and he could feel it give. She canned the remainder of the garden in 2 days, and was after him to get his bed back up to the loft before he took cold. It rained, and the pond went blood red, and one afternoon he caught a bass from the willows in water not a foot deep, and cleaned it and held the tiny heart in the palm of his hand, still beating. His bed was still on the porch. These nights he could not bear to be in the house. He would go out after dinner and come back at bedtime, and then out again directly she was asleep, walking the dark roads, passing by the shacks and houses, the people illumined yellowly behind the window lights in gestures mute and enigmatic. One night, cutting through a field, he came upon 2 figures struggling in the grass, naked, white, and frantic in the gloss of the quarter moon as stranded fish. He went on. They did not see him. When he got to the road, he began to run, his shoes slapping loud on the asphalt till they burned and stung, ran till his chest was seared. Below the forks of the road in Stiefel's yard was a great tulip poplar. He crawled up the kept grass bank and folded in the shadows of the trunk like a malefactor gone to earth, his breath dragging coals through his lungs. He sat there for a long time, watching the lights go out one by one over the valley. Sound of voices close and urgent on the acoustic night air, doors falling to, laughter. An encampment settling for rest, council fires put out. In caverns by torchlight, a congress of fiends and warlocks rattling old dry bones in wistful hunger. You going to hunt him out, when you're old enough. Going to find the man that took away your daddy. Remember, fierce and already aging face down thrust into his, sweet sour smell.
How can I?
He had begun to cry.
Your daddy'd have knowed how. He was a God-fearing man, if he never took much to church meeting. The Lord will show you, boy. He will not forsake them what believe. Pray, and the way will be made known to ye. You swear it, boy.
His arm was growing numb with pain. Could feel her tremble through the clutched hand.
I swear, he said. You won't never forget. No, never long as you live. Long as I live. Yes,
she said.
Long as I won't forget neither,
she said, tightening once more on his arm for a moment, leaning her huge face at him.
And she hissed, He won't forget neither. I live.
He never forgot. From somewhere in the darkness came the sound of a banjo, tentative chords, a message. What news? Old loves reconsummated, sickness, a child's crying. Silence now in the houses, repose. Even to those for whom no end of night could bring rest enough. And silence, the music fled in the seeping amber warmth of innumerable dreams laid to death upon the hearth, ghostly and still. The morning is yet to the nether end of the earth, and he is weary. Bowing the grass in like sadness, the dew followed him home and sealed his door. Still the weather held, and the rain. The days were gray and misty, and in the night the trees dripped and spattered. The pond had been bottled, and he watched them drifting about one morning while still fishing from the limestone ledge at the upper end. Later a man came in a skiff, poling through the fog, and he saw him stop what bottle skittered and jerked and lift up the lines to take off the fish. The man saw him and nodded his head, and he nodded back. The skiff circled at the upper end and returned down the pond, silent but for the thud of the pole on the sternboards. He was pushing hard now, and the days were bending under, and cold weather came. His cot was still on the porch, and daily he checked the undoing of the yard trees, woke to a red world with the sun wedged huge and squat in the mountain gap and the maples incandescent. Couched in his musty blanket, he sniffed to test the air. A limp breeze, water-wrought and tempered with smoke, came lisping through the screen with no news yet. He waited. In the slow-bleeding month of October he watched, looking torpid and heavy-lidded as a toad, his nerves coiled and tuned like a waiting cat's. One evening coming from the store he saw her on the road, and she smiled at him and said, "Heidi." He nodded and went on, heard them giggle behind him. He hadn't seen her since late in the summer. He was crossing Saunders Field and bound for the creek, the homemade croaker Saxane riding his shoulder like a tramp's dunnage. He never saw her until she spoke, leaning against a post with her hands capping the top of it and her chin resting on them. She looked as if she might have been standing there for days with an incalculable patience, just waiting for him to come by. Well, he thought, she ain't old enough to own the land to want to run me off of it, even if she is big enough. So he said howdy back to her. "Your name's John Wesley, ain't it?" He started to say yes'm, but he said, "Yep, that's my name." She moved down from the post and came toward him, unhurried, sauntering. She wore a cotton print dress that buttoned up like a housecoat, and where it stretched across her belly or strained to cover her rolling breasts, white flesh and pink silk pursed out between the buttons. She pulled a weed and began chewing on it, eyeing him sidewise, standing in front of him now and favoring one leg so that her hip tilted out. "What you doing?" she asked. "Just messing around," he said. "Messing around?" "Yeah, that's all." She nudged a stone with the toe of her slipper. "Who you messing around with?" "Why, nobody. Just me." The tips of her breasts were printed in the cloth like coins. She was watching him watch. "You ain't supposed to mess around with yourself," she told him, part of a smile at her mouth corners and eyes squinting in mischief. "Who says that?" he asked. "Me. Preacher says that, too." "I got to get on," he said. "You going to mess with yourself some more?" He started on, and she fell in alongside him. "Where you going?" she asked. "Pond," he said. "What you going there for?" "Fish." "Fish? Fishing? You ain't got a pole." "Got one over there," he told her. "Hid." "You don't carry your pole with you?" "No." She giggled. They were walking along slow, much slower than he walked. After a while, when she didn't say anything, he asked her where she was going. "Me?" she said. "I ain't going nowhere. Just messing around." "Who you going to mess around with?" She laughed. "You'd like to know, wouldn't you?" "No.
I don't care who you mess with. He walked on, looking up at the trees, the sky. You carry a fish in that? What's that? She was pointing at the croaker seine. That, she said. Oh, no, that's a seine. I got to seine me some minnows first before I go to the pond. She didn't leave. Wading up the creek, poking the pole of the seine up under the banks, he would see her walking along or standing and watching. Where the honeysuckles thinned at one place, she came up to the bank and took off her shoes and kicked at the water with her toes as he went by. When he looked back, she was in the creek to her knees, with her skirt hiked up and tucked under in the waist of her bloomers, and her thighs were incredibly white against the surge of brown water, where she walked unsteadily into the current, leaning, her breasts swinging. She caught up to him and splashed water at him. She said, You don't know my name, do you? All right, he said. What's your name? What do you care? I don't care, you just... What did you ask me for, then? I never... He stopped. You was the one asked me if... Juanita, she said. If you just got to know. Juanita Tipton. I live over yonder. She motioned vaguely beyond the creek, across the summer ruins of a cornfield, a stand of walnut trees surrounding a stained house with a green tin roof. He nodded, fell to seining again. He didn't have enough floats, and the minnows kept going over the back. Still, he had half a dozen in the can tied to his belt. You like to do this? She asked over his shoulder. He turned around and looked at her. She was standing on a rock with her legs together. The back of her dress had come down and was dark and wet. You got a leech, he said. I got to what? Leech, he said. You got one on your leg. She looked down. It didn't take her long to find it, a fat brown one just below her knee, with a thin ribbon of blood going pink on the wetness of her shin. She put her hand to her mouth and just stood there looking at it. It was a pretty good-sized leech for the creek, although the pond leeches came much bigger. She just kept looking at it, and after a while he said, Ain't you going to take him off? That moved her. She looked up at him, and her face went red. God damn you, she said. God damn you for a... God damn you anyway. Hell, I never put him there. Take it off. Damn you. God, will you take it off? He sloshed over to where she was. Standing like that in water, halfway to his waist, and her up on the rock, he could see up her thighs to where the skirt was tucked into her bloomers. He got hold of the leech, trying to look up and not to at the same time, and feeling giddy, shaky, and pulled it loose and flipped it past her onto the bank. He said, You ought not to wade barefooted. He had felt for a minute that he wasn't even afraid of her anymore, and all he could remember now was running. The huge expanse of flesh and the bloomers and her holding him by the collar with her feet somehow in the water on either side of him, until he jerked away with his shirt ripping loudly and splashed back through the creek to the bank and out and across Saunders Field, shedding water and minnows from his bucket with the foolish little seine still in his hand, and water squishing in his shoes, running. She said something to the other one, and they giggled again. He went on with his bread, home, his face burning in the chill of the low October sun. When he came in through the porch, he saw that his bed was gone. She was in the kitchen. He put the bread on the table and went up to the loft, his tread hollow on the boxed steps, up to the cobwebby gloom under the slanting eaves, where the bed had been set and made with fresh linen. By now, in the early mornings, the pond was steeped in mist, thick and coldly swirling, out of which sounded the gabble of phantom ducks. At sunrise, the whole valley would be glazed white and crystal, and the air smoked and tangy from the stoves, and later from the open fires where women gathered about the kettles with long wooden paddles, elvish-looking in their shawls and bonnets, a clutch of trolls at their potions. First days of frost, cold, smoky days, with hogs screaming, and now and again the distant hound calls of geese, howling down the south in thin V's, flattening on the horizon to a line, and then gone. He cut wood, went out early to the rising stacks of new pine kindling, rimed and shining in the morning frost like wedges of frozen honey. He worked hard at it, and the days went. For that much time he would have buried the yard house-high in stovewood. If he'd lived, she told him one evening, you wouldn't want for nothing. And him disabled in the war with that platinum plate in his head and all. Turned down the government disability, he did. Too proud. Wouldn't take no handout from nobody, even if it was the government. He was a provider, all right. May the Lord God Jesus keep him. Yes,
she said, eyeing him doubtfully.
You make half the man he was, and you'll be going some.
The fire ticked on in the little stove, cherrying softly the one side of it till the cracks in the old iron showed like thin spiders sprawled there. Rocking quietly in her chair, she had the appearance of one engaged in some grim and persevering endeavor in which hope was the only useful implement. Not even patience. As if perhaps in some indistinct future, the chair itself would rise and bear her away to glory with her sitting fiercely sedate, and her feet maybe tucked under the rung, her skirt gathered about her. She was humming something in her high nasal hum, faint evocation of summer bees. The coals chuckled, settled with easy sifting sounds. She rocked. That was how winter came that year. Through the weary slide of the wiper on the glass, the water sluicing away, Silder watched the rain dance in the lights, flash from the black road. Behind him the siren sounded again, louder and with a new sense of urgency. I never tried it in the rain, he was thinking. The accelerator pedal was crushed hard under his foot, and he watched the needle strain upward to 60 before he let off for the next curve. Got to do it before I start up the mountain, he told himself, or I'm in a sling. So it would have to be at the forks of the road. Lightning glared in threatful illusions of proximity, and quick shapes appeared in the road, leapt from ditch or tree in configurations antic and bizarre. Ghosts of mist rose sadly from the paving and broke in willowy shreds upon the hood, the windshield. One curve more. Behind him the rear window blackened. Then the slow, inexorable reach of lights crept out and fingered their way across the hillside off to his left, remarking scrub pines, ropes of limestone stretched in a yellow path like rows of somnolent sheep. When he reached the top of the hill, the lights dropped away, and the siren sounded again. I can take a wide sweep, he told himself hopefully. The road looked like oil. Then there was no more time, and he was there, nerve and muscle on their own, and him just watching. He went into it at 40 by the speedometer, saw the store blink its square eyes, cut the wheel to the left, one hand locking for just a moment the handbrake. He couldn't see any more then. He brought the wheel back, the brake already released. Except he couldn't pull it sharp enough, and the front end was sliding away and not turning. Then it gave, and a streaming herd of trees swam past in the lights, as if rushing headlong off the very rim of the earth, and the store loomed again, glazed onto the green frieze, spinning past starkly white and in incredible elongation. And yet once more, trees and building in one long blur, and then he was jarred from the rear by a solid whump of a sound, and heard something snap like a dry stick cracking, and then a rattling spray of glass. The lights had come to rest straight back down the road, and he already had the shift lever up in second, the tires whining, inching forward, when the cruiser leapt over the hill before him. Then the tires bit, and he was gone, raking a fender of the other car on the way out with deliberate skill. Behind him the store squinted, with half a post leaning in through one window and a corner of the porch sagging down, abject and humble in the pounding rain. Silder popped a match on the dash and lit a cigarette. "Adios, John," he said. He sang quietly to himself. "Long gone ain't he lucky, long gone from Kentucky," rocking slightly with the car's motion as it strung the curves. It was in August that he had found the sparrowhawk on the mountain road, crouched in the dust with one small falcon wing, fanned and limp, eyeing him without malice or fear. Something hard there, implacable and ungiving. It followed his movements as he approached and then turned its head when he reached out his hand to it, picked it up, feeling it warm and palpitant in the palm of his hand, not watching him, not moving, but only looking out over the valley calmly with its cold, glinting occipital eyes, its hackles riffling in the wind. He carried it home and put it in a box in the loft and fed it meat and grasshoppers for 3 days, and then it died. Saturday he went into town with Mr. Eller, holding the bag in one hand and sitting up high in the cab of the old truck, watching the fields go by, and then houses, and more of them, and finally stores and filling stations, the river bridge, and beyond that, the shape of the city against the hot morning sky. "How you getting back?" Mr. Eller asked. "I'll get back," he said. "I got some things to do." He was standing on the running board, one foot in the street, at the corner of Gay and Main. "Here," Mr. Eller said, leaning across the seat, holding his hand down. "What?" "Here. I got money," he said. "It's okay." "Go on, damn it," the man said. He was shaking the quarter at him. Behind them, a horn sounded.
"Okay," he said. He took the quarter. "Thanks, I'll see you."
He slammed the door and the truck pulled away, Mr. Eller lifting his hand once in parting. He waved at the back of his head in the rear glass, crossed the street, and went up the walk to the courthouse, up the marble stairs and inside. There was a woman at a small desk just inside the door fanning herself with a sheaf of forms. He stood for a few minutes looking around the hall and reading the signs over the doors, and finally she asked him what it was that he needed. He held the bag up. "Hawk Bounty," he said. "Oh," she said. "I think you go in yonder." "Where's that?" "Over there." She pointed to a hallway. "Much obliged," he said. There was a long counter, and behind it were other women at desks. He stood there for a while, and then one of them got up and came over to him and said, "Yes?" He hefted the ratty little bag to the counter. From the sweat-crinkled neck exuded an odor rich and putrid even above the stale, musty smell of the old building. The woman eyed the package with suspicion, then alarm as the seeping gases reached her nostrils. Delicately, with 2 fingers, she touched the pink mouthing of the bag, withdrew. He upended it and slid the malodorous contents out on the polished wood in a billowing well of feathers. She stepped back and looked at it. Then she said, not suspiciously or even inquiringly, but only by way of establishing her capacity as official, "Is it a chicken hawk?" "Yes'm," he said. "It's a young'un." "I see." She turned sharply and disappeared on a click of heels behind a tier of green filing cabinets. In a few minutes, she was back with a little pad of printed forms, stopping further down the counter and writing now with a pen from a gathering of inkstands there. He waited. When she had finished, she tore the form from the pad and came back and handed it to him. "Sign where the X's are," she told him. "Then take it to the cashier's office. Down the hall." She pointed. He signed the 2 lines with the pen, handed it back, and started away when she called him back. "I wonder if you would mind," she said, wrinkling her nose and poking a squeamish finger at the little bird. "Mind putting it back in the bag for me?" He did. Holding the slip of paper delicately in one hand and waiting the ink to dry, he went to collect his bounty. He left through the open door, with the wind hollowing through into the hall and skirmishing with the papers on the bulletin board. Warm wind of the summer forenoon fused with a scent of buckeyes, swirling chains of soot about on the stone steps. He held the dollar in his hand, folded neatly twice. When he got outside, he took it and folded it again, making a square of it, and thrust it down between the copper rivets into the watch pocket of his overall pants. He patted it flat and went down the walk past the grimy trees, the monuments, the poised and interminably peering statue, and out to the street. A band was playing, wavering on the heat of the city, strains of old hymns, martial and distantly strident. Rows of cars were herded in shimmering somnolence beneath the vapor of exhaust fumes, and at the intersection stood a policeman at parade rest. He crossed the street, and the music came suddenly louder, as if a door had opened somewhere. When he got to the corner, he could see them coming, 8 and 10 abreast, a solemn phalanx of worn maroon, the drill cloth seedy and polished even at that distance, and their instruments glinting dully in the sun. In a little knot to the fore marched the leader, tall-hatted and batoned, and the 4 guidons bracing up their masts, the colors furling listlessly. A pair of tubas in the mass behind them bobbed and rode like balloons, leaped ludicrously above the marchers' heads, and belched their frog notes in off-counterpoint to the gasping rattle of the other instruments. Behind the marchers came a slowly wending caravan of buses, through the windows of which flocks of pennants waved and fluttered. He watched, gathered up and pressed in the crowd, the people sweating in their thin summer clothes, a maze of shapes and colors similar only in the dark patches under their armpits, straining their necks, toe-standing, holding up children. The marchers passed them under the canopy of heat, sweaty and desperate-looking. He saw the near tuba player, red-faced and wild, as if perhaps he were obliged to puff at his instrument to keep it from deflating and drooping down over the heads of his fellows. They passed in an enormous shudder of sound, and the buses came, laborious in low gear, churning out balls of hazy blue smoke, their windows alive with streamers, pennants, placards, small faces. Long paper banners ran the length of the buses proclaiming for Christ in tall red letters, and for sobriety, offering to vote against the devil when and wherever he ran for office. One by one they passed, and again the multicolored flags in small children's hands waving at the spectators, who in turn mopped listlessly at their necks and faces with handkerchiefs. A blue and yellow card legended, "Don't make my daddy a drunkard," fell to the street like a stricken bird, leaving an empty hand clutching at the window. The next bus splintered and ground the flag stem and printed tire treads over the sign. Then the music stopped abruptly, and there was only the uneasy shifting of the crowd, the slow drone of the buses. The pennants and signs came gradually to rest, to a collective embarrassment as if someone had died, and they went on that way until the last bus was by, the little faces looking out solemn as refugees, onto the bridge and so out of the city. The crowds ebbed into the streets, and thinned, and the traffic began, the cars moving and the streetcars clicking past. He was still standing on the sidewalk, and now he saw the city, steamed and weaving in heat, and rising above the new facings of glass and tile, the bare outlandish buildings, towering columns of brick, adorned with fantastic motley, arches, lintels, fluted and arabesque, flowered columns and crow-stepped gables, bay windows over corbels carved in shapes of feet, heads of nameless animals, Pompeian figures. Here and there, gargoyled and crocketed, wreathed dates commemorating the perpetration of the structure. Rows of pigeons dozed on the high ledges, and the heat rose in visible waves up from the paving. He patted the folded dollar again and started up Gay Street. When he got to the Strand, he stopped and studied the pictures advertising the Saturday serial and fingered the quarter. Then he turned left and went up to Market Square. On the corner a man was screaming incoherently and brandishing a tattered Bible. Next him stood an old woman strapped into an accordion, mute and patient as a draft horse. He crossed the street behind the half-circle of spectators. The man stopped screaming and the accordion began, and they sang, the two voices hoarse and high-pitched, rising in a sad quaver, to the calliope-like creaking of the instrument. He went up the far side of the square under the shadow of the market house past brown country faces, peering from among their carts and trucks, perched on crates, old women with faces like dried fruit set deep in their hooded bonnets, shaggy, striated, and hook-toothed as coconut carvings, shabby backlanders trafficking in the wares of the earth, higgling their goods from a long row of ancient vehicles backed obliquely against a curb and freighted with fruits and vegetables, eggs and berries, honey and jars and boxes of nuts, bundles of roots and herbs from sassafras to boneset, a bordello of potted plants and flowers. By shoe windows where shoddy footgear rose in dusty tiers, and clothing stores in whose vestibules iron racks stood packed with used coats, past bins of socks and stockings, a meat market where hams and rib cages dangled like gibbeted miscreants, and in the glass cases, square porcelain trays piled with meat white-spotted and trichinella-ridden, chunks of liver the color of clay tottering up from motes of watery blood, a tray of brains, unidentifiable gobbets of flesh scattered here and there. Among overalled men and blind men and amputees on roller carts or crutches, flour and feed bags piled on the walk, and pencil peddlers holding out their tireless arms, past stalls and cribs and holes in the wall vending tobacco in cut or plug, leaf or bag, and snuff, sweet or Scotch in little tins, pipes and lighters, and an esotery of small items down to pornographic picture books, past cafes reeking with burned coffee, an effluvium of frying meat, an indistinguishable medley of smells. Under the crystal's marquee of light bulbs, a group of countrymen stood gazing hard past the box office, where a tired-looking woman sat beneath a sign, adults 25, children 11, watching the film through a missing panel of curtain. Sounds of hooves and gunfire issued onto the street. He couldn't see past or over them, and went on by up the square, until he stood before a window garnished with shapes of wood and metal, among which he recognized only a few common hand tools. He held his hand up to one eye to break the glare of light on the glass, and he could see them in the dim interior, hanging from their nail on the wall. He checked the dollar and went in. His footfalls were muffled on the dark oiled floors, bearing him into an atmosphere heavy with smells of leather and iron, machine oil, seed, beneath strange objects hung from hooks in the ceiling, past barrels of nails to the counter. They were hanging down by their chains and looking fierce and ancient among the trace chains and harness, bucksaws and axe helves. A clerk passed behind the counter and waited on a man idly turning a brass doorknob in his hand. Together they disappeared into the gloom, ducking under a fringe of dangling strap leather to the rear of the store. A few minutes later, a gray-haired man came up the aisle and leaned on the counter looking down at him. "Can I help you, son?" he said.
How much are they? He motioned vaguely past the man as if there were but one item of merchandise displayed there. The traps. Your traps there. The man turned. Traps? Steel traps. Yes, sir. Well, he said, let's see. What size? Them. He pointed. Number 1s. The man studied the dull metal shapes as if aware for the first time of their existence, seemingly puzzled not over their price, but as to how they came to be there in the first place. Then he said, yes, and lifted one down and set it on the counter before the boy at a quarter angle, straightening the chain, as one might show a watch or a piece of jewelry. The boy touched the oiled smoothness of it, pan, trigger, jaws, spring. How much? He asked again. 30 cents. 30 cents, the boy repeated. Less than you buy by the dozen. They're $3 the dozen. The boy turned that over in his mind. That would make 'em 25 then, wouldn't it? Well, the man said, 12 and 3, 4 for $1, is right. 25 cents is right. Well, he said, I aim to get a dozen, but I can't get all of 'em together at the same time. So I wonder if I couldn't get 4 of 'em today and then get the rest later on? The man looked at him for a minute, and then he smiled. Why, I reckon you could, he said. Of course you'd have to sign a pledge for the whole dozen, so as for me to let you have the 4 at the dozen price. The boy nodded. He reached up and unhooked 3 more traps and put them on the counter, their chains rattling angrily, reached under the cash register, and came up with a book of old order forms. He wrote in it for a while and then tore off 2 copies and handed one to the boy. Sign that, he said. He was holding out the pen. The boy took it and started to write. Better read it first, the man cautioned. He read it, ciphering out the tall, thin handwriting. I, the undersigned, do hereby agree to purchase 8 Victor No. 1 traps from the Farm and Home Supply Store prior to January 1st, 1941. Price to be at 25 cents each. Signed his name to the bottom and handed back the pen. The man took the signed paper and handed him the other one, the carbon. This is your copy, he told him. The boy took it and folded it, then took the dollar from his watch pocket and smoothed it on the counter. The man took the dollar and rang it up in the register. Wait till I get you a poke, he said. He pulled a sheet of brown paper from a roll and wrapped the traps in it and tied them with string. The boy took the package, hefting the weight of it in his hands. I'll be back to get the other uns afore long, he told the man. Then he was gone, out into the blinding sunshine among the high-shouldered crowds, sped and well-wished by an old man's smile. They were still tied up in the brown paper and wedged in back of the rafter. On the morning of the 15th of November, he got up early and crossed the icy floor of the loft, reached in and pulled them out and went back and sat in bed, feeling the shape of them through the dusty paper. Then he undid the string and dumped them out on the blanket. He set them one by one and touched them off with his thumb under the lower jaw, and they leaped in his hand and rang shut viciously. After a while, he hung them on a nail over the bed and went down to breakfast. He was at the creek all that day, wading in the steely water, poking among the dried honeysuckles, noting cracks and droppings, slides and dens. One sleeve was wet past the elbow, where he had reached to feel an underwater hole, and his toes were numb in the leaky knee boots. By the time he got home, he was chilled and shaking, but he had his 4 sets laid. When he left the house the next morning, quietly out through the lean-to, letting the door back softly, light was just coming low in the east, breaking along the gray ridges, and a cold rim of moon still hung over the mountain. The oaks were black and stark, and the leaves in the yard were frosted and snapped under his feet with thin, glassy sounds. He cut straight through the woods to Saunders Field, hoary and pale in the hazy cold of that first light, the dead grass sheathed in ice like slender bones, rock shoals lapped in mist, and crows ambling stiff-legged on the far side where willows marked the creek's course. He crossed the fence, the icy wire in the web of his thumb like a cut. The crows skulked off on hooked wings to a clump of gray cedars. He quartered across the field, crossed another fence, near to the creek now, under the mountain, past the slain corn in hushed and battered flanks where doves had fed till late. Already he could hear the riffle and purl of the water, and then he was out on the high bank where the slide went down, a slash of packed clay case-hardened with frost,
and pressed with the scrabble marks of muskrats. And below in the water his trap lying in wait still. He went on up the creek, crossed a shelf of limestone where periwinkles crowded and watercress swayed in the current. In a honeysuckle tunnel, reeds and grasses were tramped down, and a tangled sheaf of white weed stalks floated over his second trap. The other two were close together, just below the pike bridge, and there were no sleek muskrats in them either. The creek clattered down through green stone grottos, over the rocks, curling, eddying under the white roots of cottonwoods, where crawfish peered out with stemmed eyes. And the sun running red on the mountain, high killie and stoop of a kestrel hunting, morning spiders at their cruel work. But no muskrats struggled in his sets. After 5 mornings he pulled one trap and carried it to the bridge. There were fresh tracks on a silt bar there, and he set his trap in the shallow water where they came and went. 2 mornings later the trap was pulled out in the creek, and there was a toenail clamped in the underside of the jaws. He reset it and was at the creek an hour before daylight in the morning with a flashlight. Light pale as milk guided the old man's steps over the field to the creek and then to the mountain, stepping into the black wall of pine shadows and climbing up the lower slopes out into the hardwoods, bearded hickories, trailing grapevines, oaks, and crooked waterless cottonwoods. A quarter mile from the creek now, past the white chopped bud of a bee tree lately felled, past the little hooked Indian tree, and passing silent and cat-like up the mountain in the darkness under latticed leaves scudding against the sky in some small wind. Light saw him through the thick summer ivy and over windfalls and limestone, past the sink where on a high bluff among trilobites and fish bones, shells of ossified crustaceans from an ancient sea, a great stone tusk jutted. The old man kept to a steep path off to the right and came through the last thick brush to the mountain road, breathing heavily. He stopped there to lean on his cane, and the first slant of light of moon topped the mountain on the far side, so that the crest of it was washed in a watery silver, and the dust of the road shone like mica. A half-mile to his left was the circle at the end of the road, and beyond that the fence and the installation. The road to the spray pit was but a few yards to the right of where he stood in the road now, hearing his breath soar out in the silence. He looked as one peering from vast heights, the sky seeming to lie below him in a measureless spread, flickering like foil by half-light and gleaming lamely into shadow where it folded to the trees. Years back on summer nights he used to walk with neighbor boys 2 miles to the store to buy candy and cigars. They would come back over the warm and deserted roads talking and smoking the cigars. One night, taking a shortcut, they passed a house and saw through one window a woman undressing for bed. The others had gone back for a second look, but he would not go, and they laughed at him. The old man remembered it now with dim regret, and remembered such nights when the air was warm as a breath, and the moon no dead thing. He started down the road to the orchard path and to the pit for this second look. The moon was higher now as he came past the stand of bullbriars into the orchard, the blackened limbs of trees falling flatly as paper across the path, and the red puddle of moon moving as he moved, sliding sodden and glob-like from limb to limb, fatly surreptitious, watching as he watched. His feet moved ahead of him, disembodied and unfamiliar, floating through the banded shadows, and the lime-colored grass swished and folded, breaking to light-shivered undersides like glass splintering softly, catching the pale light and then rushing to darkness. Excepting the counterpoint of crickets, there was no other sound. Where the road curved to bring into view the clearing, the dim outline of the pit, the old man paused. The glade seemed invested with an aura of antiquity, overhung with a silence both spectral and reverent. He could feel something cold rising up in him and was almost of a mind to turn back. Taking a little tighter grip upon his cane, he stood so for a while, then stepped into the clearing, and came to the edge of the pit, ushering his own presence forward like a child to the pale gray lip of concrete stretched in the grass like a fallen monument, stepped up on it and looked into the black square of the pit incised geometrically into the earth. The old man had visited here in the years past, but never by night. Each winter he came and cut a cedar to serve for wreath and covering, the waxed and ciliate sprigs holding their green well into the spring before the heat blasted them, and even then they held their shape, like reproductions in dull copper. It took a year's weather to fret them into the aromatic humus which steeped in what rainwater the pit held, and so rendered in turn a tannic liquor dark as pitchblende, by which the old man fancied had long been stained the worm-scored bones that lay here. These things he observed, for he was a watcher of the seasons and their work. By the coming Christmas, he would have cut the 7th cedar, and with this he felt might come an end to his long-dead watch. So he stood, looking down, and now he thought it less eerie than he had supposed, the half-darkness about him almost sheltering. Seeing that the range of his visibility extended at least partially into the pit, he even sat down on the concrete edge and dangled his feet. He tugged a pipe from the folds of his overalls, filled it from a small sack of tobacco, and lit it, puffing deeply, watched the smoke pale against the night by the match flare. Then he held the match out over the pit and peered down, but he could not see even the rust-colored tips of the cedars, and the match burned down to his thumb, and he dropped it. There was nothing. The dead had risen and gone. No revenant mourned here the unburied remains. Slanting down the near wall was a half-square of light, and he could see the blotches of moss and fungus on the pale concrete like land shapes from some ancient atlas. But that was all. Then in the silence there came from the pit a single momentary water sound, softly, a small, almost tentative slosh. He got to his feet and stepped back, then turned and trotted back up the path with his queer shambling gait, neither a run nor a walk, waving his cane about curiously. Back in the road he slowed his steps. His breath was rasping and his chest tight. He wandered up the road away and came to a cleared place where he could see down through the thin trees, faced with light, the slope of the ground pouring over like a waterfall to break somewhere below, and the small yellow pinholes, lights from shacks and houses, warmth and life, burning steadfast among the fitful lightning bugs. A dog barked. He squatted on one heel in the road, tilted his cane against his shoulder, waved a handful of the warm dust through his fingers. A light breeze was coming up from the valley. To his right, off beyond the last black swatch of trees in silhouette cresting the knob, he could hear a long cry of tires on the curves. In a little while, the sound of a motor racking the night. The car came through the cut of the mountain, howling brokenly in the wind gap. Fine pencils of light appeared far below him, swinging in arc, shadows racing on the lit trees, and then lining down the road, and the car hurtling into sight, small and black, pushing the lights ahead of it. It rocketed down the grade, and in a thin and slowly fading wail of rubber, slid to darkness again where the road curved at the foot of the mountain. The old man's legs began to cramp under him, and he rose and stood about, trying to work the stiffness out of them. He balanced on one leg and bent himself up and down by the strength of his knee. Then he stooped all the way down and tried to raise himself, an old man exercising at midnight on a mountain top. Too old to get up that way. And that was the good leg, too. He hadn't been able to do it with the other leg for years, and it creaked like dry harness. It still had birdshot in it, above the knee and higher, almost. He could remember yet the doctor pointing to the last little blue hole, to where a man surely oughtn't to be hid. Years later the leg had begun to weaken. The head, too, the old man told himself, and got up, looked out over the valley once more before starting up the road. Toward Red Branch a dog barked again. Another answered, and another, their calls and yaps spreading across the valley until the last sound was thin and distant as an echo. No dogs howled in the hopper or down along Forked Creek where the old man lived. He thought of Scout bedded under the house, old and lame, with his tattered hide half naked of hair, the bald patches crusted and scaly-skinned as a lizard. Scout with his hand-stitched belly and ribboned ears, split their length in places, whose brows so folded over his eyes that he could see at all only by holding up his head, which gave him an inquisitive air as he walked, as if he followed forever some wonderful odor strung out before him. Big even for a red bone, a strong dog in his day, but he was 17 years old. The old man had traded a broken shotgun for him when he was a pup. He walked and ruminated and furrowed the dust absently with his cane, until he came to the circle at the end of the road and the knoll beyond where the trees had been plucked from the ground and not even a weed grew. A barren spot, bright in the moonwash, mercurial and luminescent as a sea, the pits from which the trees had been wrenched dark on the naked bulb of the mountain as moon craters. And on the very promontory of this lunar scene, the tank like a great silver icon, fat and bald and sinister. When he got to the fence, he stopped and leaned his cane and hooked his fingers through the mesh of the wire. Within the enclosure there was no movement. The great dome stood complacent, huge, seeming older than the very dirt, the rocks, as if it had spawned them of itself and stood surveying the work, clean and coldly gleaming and capable of infinite contempt. He clung there wrapped in the fence for some time, perhaps the better part of an hour. He did not move except that from time to time he licked the cold metal of the diamond wire with his tongue. When the old man reached home again, the moon was down. He did not remember coming back down the mountain. But there was the house looming, taking shape as he approached, and he felt that he had come a great distance, a sleepwalker who might have spanned vast and dangerous terrains unwittingly and unharmed. As he turned his steps up the path, a shadow swirled past his knees and fled soundlessly into the night. In one corner of the front room there was an old wooden footlocker, and the old man cleared away papers and clothes from the top of it and set the lamp on the floor close by. Then he undid the broken hasp and lifted it open. He rummaged through it, stopping now and again to examine some object. A brass watch weighing perhaps 1/4 pound, a pair of cock gaffs, a .32 rimfire revolver with owl head grips and the hand broken so that the cylinder spun smooth as a barrel in water. Reams and sheafs of old catalogues and lists he thumbed through. An 8-gauge shotgun shell. At length he came up with a small square box decorated with flying ducks, and this he set on the floor beside the lamp. He dropped the lid of the locker closed, and the lamp flickered. On the wall, a black ghoul hulking over a bier wavered. He took the lamp and the box to the kitchen and placed them on the table. From the drawer he took a short, curved meat knife and tested the edge on his thumb, pulled the drawer out further, and, reaching back in it, came out with a worn gray piece of soapstone. With this he honed the knife, trying it from time to time on the hair of his arm until he was satisfied, then replaced the stone and opened the box. There were 12 bright red wax tubes in it, and he set them out on the table one by one, their dull brass bases orange in the lamp glow. He selected one and with the knife made a thin cut around the base of the paper where the brass met. He examined it carefully, then deepened the cut, turning the shell against the blade. He checked it again, nodded to his nodding shadow, and put the shell back in the box. He performed the same operation on the remaining 11, putting each in turn in the box again. When he had finished, he replaced the knife in the drawer and returned to the front room, where he took them one by one, the 12 circumcised shotgun shells, and deposited them in the pocket of his coat. F. Hobie's father had been dead too long for the people who admired F. to remember him. They were a whiskey-making family before whiskey-making was illegal, their family history mythical, pre-literate, and legendary. They had neither increased nor prospered, and now Garland was the last surviving son. F. had died in a car wreck in 1937, less than a year after coming out of Brushy Mountain. Not in the wreck, either. He lived 3 weeks and was even back on his feet where he wasn't supposed to be at all, and in the store where people looked uneasily at his gaunt frame, who had weighed just short of 300 pounds. He had been thrown clear of the car, and then the car had rolled on top of him, and they had removed a good part of his insides in the process of restoring him to health. He was showing them the slick red scar that angled across his withered paunch, and sucking long draughts from an orange dope. "They performed an autopsy on me, and I lived," he told them. Then he laughed and got down off the drink box, emptied his orange, and reached to put it in the rack. The bottle clattered on the floor. He lurched once, wildly, collapsed into the bread rack, and went to the floor in a cascade of cupcakes and moon pies. So there were only 2 Hobies, Garland and his mother, and hard luck dogged them. Within a month, Jack the Runner was arrested and sent up to Brushy for 3 years himself, and county deputies broke into their smokehouse and took off what whiskey was there, and took Mrs. Hobie, aged 78, off to jail, sending her back home only when it was discovered she had cancer of the duodenum. So Garland had to carry the whiskey up the mountain now to a den in the honeysuckles just below the circle, and leave it there for Marion Silder to pick up and haul to Knoxville. There was a gate across the Orchard Road, since the installation had been set up on the mountain, and only official carriers were permitted access. Olive-painted trucks with gold emblems on the doors, passing in and out of the gate, the men in drab fatigues locking and unlocking the chain sedulously. With like diligence, Silder bolted and unbolted the ring plate that held the chain on his comings and goings in the old Plymouth. But the 2 parties using the road kept different hours, and they never met. It was 4 o'clock in the morning when Silder heard the old man shoot the first hole in the tank. He almost let go the case of whiskey he was carrying, and then when the second shot came, hard upon the first, he set the case down carefully and stood dead still, waiting for cries, commands, an explanation. All was quiet. The birds were stilled in their first tentative and querulous chirpings. Low in the east and beyond the town, a gray, soulless dawn gnawed the horizon into shape. He was braced for another report, holding his breath, echoing the outrageously loud concussion in his inner ear before it came. 2 more shots, evenly spaced. Something deliberate about them. Silder made his way stealthily along the edge of the honeysuckle jungle, crossed an open space, arm of the orchard, going in the direction of the shooting. When he got to the edge of the clearing where the installation stood, he could see the man with the muzzle of the gun sticking through the fence wire. He fired and the barrel came up short, sending waves out along the woven mesh and back. The man jerked under the recoil and the smoke spurted, slowed, and billowed in the damp air. There were 6 neat black holes in the polished skin of the tank, angled up across it in a staggered line. The man broke the gun and picked the shells out. Silder saw him hold them up for brief inspection before throwing them to one side, and saw them dance in the new light and knew what they were. The brass bases of the shells only, flickering and turning like coins as they fell. The man was putting 2 more shells into the breech of the shotgun, and Silder could see them now, and the dull red of the waxed cardboard tubes that had been missing from the extracted cases. The man didn't hesitate. He raised the gun and breeched it in one quick motion. 2 more blasts ripped the silence, and 2 holes appeared now in the lower corner. He was making a huge, crude X across the face of the tank. Again he examined the bits of brass before reloading. Silder watched wide-eyed from his retreat in the bushes. He could hear the solid whop of the full cases landing into the tank, and the tank seemed to reel under the impact like a thing alive. There was something ghastly and horrific about it, and he had the impression that this gnomic old man had brought with him an inexhaustible supply of shells, and would cease his cannonading only when he became too weary to lift the gun. He backed out of his hiding place and returned to the car. Daylight was coming on fast, and he began to worry lest the old man's shooting bring investigation. He was late anyway, and didn't know but that the official carriers might use the road at this hour, even if a crazy old man wasn't shooting holes in their responsibility with a shotgun and rung shells. There were 6 cases of whiskey still in the honeysuckles, and he brought them out 2 at a time with a hobbling half-run. The firing had ceased. He got the turtle deck loaded and fastened, got in, and started the motor. When he pulled out of the weeds and into the road, he looked back, and there was the old man standing on the hill above him at the turnaround, holding the shotgun in one hand and leaning on a cane. Silder lowered his head and floorboarded the gas pedal. When he was safe around the first curve, he relaxed and drove slowly to the gate so as to leave as few signs as possible. He refastened the ring plate and chain, got back in, and turned onto the pike and toward Knoxville. Just beyond the creek, he passed an olive-colored truck, the driver and the other man in the cab looking serious and official, but somewhat sleepy and not in any particular hurry. Genial, unofficial, and awake, Marion Silder drove to town. His light played on the wet mud banks among roots and stumps, a sheaf of brown honeysuckle hanging down and trailing in the water like hair. His boots made sucking sounds as he waded against the slight current, walked softly the silted floor of the creek. He could hear a car on top of the mountain coming down, the exhaust rattling and the tires sounding on the switchbacks. He came to the bridge and waded to the spit of loam filled in against the concrete wall. Throwing his light to the set, he could see the trap with the jaws cocked and the pan all brown-looking under the water and wrinkling in the small ebb and lap of it. He put the flashlight in his pocket and squatted on the sand among tracks of feet and tails, wiggling his numb toes, huddling down in his mackinaw and breathing slowly into his cupped hands, listening in the darkness to the water curling past his feet with small muted water sounds, to his cough echoing hollow and blankly among the beams overhead. The tires sounded again, closer, and then the motor revving between engagements of the clutch and the explosive sound of the shift to high gear as the car came out of the last turn at the base of the mountain. He followed with his muscles the downward thrust of the lever, locked the shift home arm and shoulder. The car was on the straight stretch, approaching the creek, and he could feel the vibrations of it, waiting for it to pass overhead. It did not. He heard the motor building speed, and then there was a sudden explosion, a dog-like yelp, followed by a suspension of all sound, a momentary eclipse of animation even to the water and his own breathing. The trees at his left leaped, wild with light, went out again. There came an eruption of limbs cracking, splitting, of wrenched metal screaming like slate, a heavy and final concussion like a steel drum bursting. Silence again, through which filtered a thin and diminishing rain of glass. By the pulsing wash of water at his feet, he knew that it was in the creek, and he tugged his flashlight free and poked the beam out along the bridge. The bank of the creek, where broken saplings and peeled trunks stood out whitely all about like markers, and finally to the sleek black flank of the car, upturned in the creek with the hood tilted into the water and the off-wheel still spinning idly. The side window glass was laced with myriad cracks, shining in the beam like dewed spiderwebbing, and he could not see inside. The waterline angled across it from cowl to center post, giving it an inverted look of anger. By then he was already in the creek again, scrambling low under the beamed flooring of the bridge and dipping water into his boots with gentle sluicing sounds, where he floundered in over the tops, squatting down too far under the canopy of sumacs broken over the bank, and the water on his backside icy as alcohol. He was thinking, "I'll have to pull up on the door handle." Then he was at the car, stepping and threading the brush it had pulled into the creek with it, reached for the door handle, crammed it upward, and jerked back on it with his full weight. It catapulted outward as if something inside had been galvanized into violent effort, shot open and pitched him backward through a tangle of downed saplings and into the creek. In the darkness, the water closed over him thickly as running oil, choking off his breath, filling his nose. He floundered to his feet, streaming and numb, coughing up creek water. Wiping water from his eyes, he looked about and saw the flashlight still lit, scuttling downstream over the bed of the creek like some incandescent water creature bent on escape. He waded after it, tearing recklessly about in the freezing water with the boots leaden and rolling about his shins, reached for it, his hand like a bat's shadow poised over the dome of light, and then it was gone, sucked down through the silt and mire inexplicably, and he was left balancing on one foot in the darkness with his arm and shoulder deep in the water. He groped about and finally came up with the flashlight and shook it. The metal cylinder sloshed softly, water among the batteries. He stuck it in his pocket and surged noisily back upstream to the car. He was aware for the first time now of a sickly sweet odor, faintly putrescent, and by the time he reached the car again it was thick in the air, and he knew it was whiskey without having ever smelled it. Then he could see the man taking shape out of the gloom, sprawled on the upturned headliner and half out through the open door, one arm hanging into the water. The sour smell of the whiskey, the mustiness of the old car upholstery, and what he perceived to be blood on the man's face, these burned such an image of death into his brain that he made for the bank, panicky, clawing wildly at the brush, up to the field where light and fragile shell-pink reefs broke on an unreal world. But the man wasn't dead. The boy was already on the bank, catching his breath and teetering with the dry rollings of his breakfastless stomach, when he heard a voice out of the void, hollow and half lost among the chatterings of the creek. "Hey!" The call came. He turned, hanging to a jagged sapling, saw in the shade below him a movement among the wreckage, a pale face against the dark interior of the car, the man propped up on his hands looking at him. "Hey, you," he said. He hung there looking at him. A sweep of lights tracked the shadows of the mountain, and a car hammered the bridge, echoing the noise of its passage in the creek. Finally he said, "What do you want?" The man groaned. There was a moment of silence, and then he said, "God damn, man. How about giving me a hand?" "Okay," he said. He wasn't afraid anymore, just cold, sliding down the mud and into the creek again, and then squatting in the water facing the man, wondering what he should say. He could see him quite clearly now. There was a dark smear of blood down the side of his face. The man looked at him, a suggestion of a grin breaking painfully on his face. "Played hell, didn't I?" he said. "You hurt?" His own words rattled like BBs through a clatter of teeth. He started to say something else, but a further chill rendered him inarticulate, his palsied jaw jerking like an idiot's. "I don't rightly know," the man was saying. "Yes. Here." He reached out one hand, and the boy steadied it on his shoulder while the man drew up on one knee and stepped out into the water. Then he pulled the other leg out, his face wrinkling with pain, and so was standing in the creek, his hand still on the boy's shoulder in an attitude of fatherly counsel. When he started for the bank, the hand withdrew for a moment, one faltering half-step, and then flew back and clamped there like a predatory bird striking. "Whew," the man said. "I must have busted the shit out of my leg." It took them some time to get up the bank, the boy trying to push him up and him pulling himself along by trees, roots, handfuls of dead grass, holding the leg out behind him. Then they sat in the weeds at the edge of the field, breathing white plumes into the cold morning air. In the quarter darkness, the fields looked like water, flat and gray. The boy was wet and cold Everything was wet and very cold. The man ran his hand along his leg, trying to tell whether it was broken or not. His trousers were clammy against his skin. The boy sat in front of him, hugging his shoulders and shivering, his toes lifeless, squishing in his boots when he wiggled them, and sand and grit rasping in his socks. He said, "Your head's bleeding." The man ran his hand along the side of his face. "Other side." He reached across, and his hand came away sticky with blood, and he wiped it on his trouser leg and turned to the boy. "You want to do something for me?" "Sure," the boy said. "Go down and get them keys then, and let's get the hell out of here." The boy disappeared over the cut of the bank. The man could hear him in the water. Presently he came back and handed the keys over. "Thanks," he said. "Here." He took the boy's hand and turned it over. "What did you do here?" The boy looked down at his palm. There was a black and jagged line across it. "You just do that?" the man asked. The boy looked at it dumbly. "No," he said. "I don't think so. I must have done it when I fell in the creek. Before." The man dropped the keys in his pocket and struggled to his feet. "Well, come on," he said. "We better get ourselves patched up. This way," he added, seeing the boy start for the road. He motioned toward the field and set off with a hopping gait, muttering under his breath, "Whew, mother." The boy followed him for a few paces, then quartered off to the creek again, and the man watched him go, his legs disappearing in the mist, then the rest of him, so that he seemed to be gliding away toward the line of willows marking its course like some night wraith fleeing the slow-reaching dawn, until the man wasn't sure that he had really been there at all. Then he came back with a pole and handed it to him. "Thanks," the man said. They moved on across the field through vapors of fog and wisps of light to the east, looking like the last survivors of Armageddon. Their path led them up the creek along the edges of the fields that terminated there, a curve of fields and the creek and the cupped slope of the mountain rising up to their right, along which shafts of light now appeared laterally among the ghost-gray trees. They struggled through the last fence, the boy holding the wire and trying to help him and him cussing, crossed a plank bridge at the fork of the creek, out through a cattle gate and onto the road, Henderson Valley Road. The boy fastened the gate behind them, and the man said, "We got to stay off this road. They might have found it by now, what with the light and all." They crossed the road and started up a steep dirt drive on the other side. "We can call here," the man said. The boy could see him better now. He needed a shave, and the blood crusted on the side of his face was broken in fine cracks like old dark pottery, where he winced with the pain of his slow progress, leaning heavily on the pole and breathing hoarsely. He was lean-hipped and tall, and his poplin jacket hung loosely about his shoulders. The boy thought he must be awfully cold, dressed no warmer than that, and wet to the knees besides. His own feet he couldn't feel at all now. They were like hooves rattling inside his boots. He hadn't stopped shivering the whole time. The drive climbed and turned, and then there was a house. It was an older man came to the door, a tremendous paunch slung in a gray and ragged undershirt drooped pendulously over the waist of his trousers like a sacked hog carcass. Out of a meaty face, jowled and white-stubbled with beard, two porcine eyes regarded them, blinking. "Hot-to mitty," he said, slow and evenly. Then, "Well, come on in if you're able." They entered, the man hobbling in with his pole and the boy following. The room was warm and suffused with odors of cooking meat. "Hey, old woman," their host called out. "These two fellers here just fell out of a aeroplane." A woman came to the door at the far end and looked at them. "Lord God," she said. She looked as if she might be going to say something else, then she clamped her jaw shut and disappeared with an air of briskness. The room itself was comfortable, with the new catalog store prosperity of china lamps, linoleum floors, a warm morning heater in front of which he installed himself while the two men stood talking. They paid little attention to him, and he just watched them, the injured man waving his arms, telling the story, the other scratching alternately belly and head and saying, "God Almighty," softly to himself from time to time by way of comment. After a while, the woman came to the door again and called them in for coffee. As they started for the kitchen, the younger man motioned at him. "This here is—" He nodded to the boy. "John Wesley," he said. "John Wesley. This here is June Tipton, and this is his missus." Mrs. Tipton nodded back at him as they entered the kitchen and said, "How do, John Wesley?" They sat down at the table, and June said to the woman,
"John Wesley's the one what pulled Marion out of the crick."
She looked at her husband and then to him and smiled appreciatively. The one called Marion was fishing through his pockets for cigarettes.
"That's right," he said. "I might near have drowned it."
She smiled again. After a while, she turned to her husband and said,
"What all was he doing in the crick?"
"Just laying there," June said.
"He blowed a tire and his car fell in."
She looked at the boy again and smiled and went on sipping her coffee demurely. The boy lowered his face to the steaming mug before him. Small water drops dripped down from his thawing hair, beaded and dropped from his earlobes. He was still in his soaked mackinaw, and a puddle of water was gathering on the linoleum beneath his chair. Raising his eyes above the rim of the cup, he saw the woman looking at him, leaning forward. She reached out and squeezed his coat. It made a funny squishing sound.
"Lord God," she said, "this young'un's wet clear through. He's a-fixin' to take pneumonia."
She set down her cup and began pulling at the coat, trying to help him off with it. He seemed bent and tottering under the sheer weight of it. They got him out of his coat, and by then the man had finished his coffee and stood, and he said he was ready to go if June didn't mind taking them. So they thanked the woman, declining breakfast 2 or 3 times, and filed through the door, him holding the mackinaw in his arms now like a great bundle of wet wash, and got into a pickup truck parked behind the house and pointing down the drive. June kicked the blocks from under the front wheels and got in, and they began rolling silently, gaining speed. And then he let in the clutch, and the motor came to life angrily, and they catapulted down to the road, turned left toward the mountain, the truck coughing and lurching, and a bluish haze boiling up in the cab. He sat in the middle between the 2 men, trying to keep his knees clear of the gear shift. Through a missing slat in the floorboard, he could see the gray road sliding under, and a slip of bitter wind angled up one jean leg. They drove a mile or so up the mountain and turned into another drive not unlike the one from which they started. June turned the truck around in the yard and stopped, and Marion opened the door and climbed painfully down. The boy waited.
"Better come on in,"
Marion said. The boy turned and started to say something, and then June said behind him,
"Reckon I'd better get on back." "Well," he said, "I sure am much obliged. John Wesley, you better come on in and get dried out some. Your old lady'll skin you for shoe leather."
So he clambered out of the truck and slammed the door, the truck already moving and June waving at them, and he and the man started for the house. It was full light now, the air smoky and cold. A woman was standing in the door with her arms crossed, holding her shoulders. She let them past and came in, closing the door behind her.
"Morning,"
the man said cheerfully.
"Are you hurt?"
she asked. She was small and blonde and very angry-looking.
"Breakfast ready?"
he wanted to know. She looked like she might be going to cry, her face crumpled a little and her chin quivering.
"Damn you,"
she said.
"Won't nothing do till you've killed yourself, is they? Why you ain't dead afore now is a mystery to me, and God, too, I reckon, as I don't see why he'd have any call to look out after the likes of you any more than—"
She broke off suddenly and looked at the boy, standing there, holding the coat in his arms and still dripping water.
"What about him?"
she pointed.
"Your helper. He hurt?"
The boy looked down at himself, soggy and mud-splattered, seeds and burrs collected on his water-dark jeans, like some rare botanical garden being cultivated there. At his rubber knee boots, with twigs and weeds sticking out of them, feeling the blisters they'd worn, and the cords in his ankles pulled from walking in them. One sock was completely off and scrunched down somewhere in the toe of the boot.
"I ain't no helper,"
he said.
"I just found him."
He shot a glance up at the man. He was grinning.
"Don't let him fool you," he said. "He was driving. But he ain't hurt, I don't reckon. I ain't neither. My leg is just wore out fighting that dashboard."
"Your head's wore out is what's wore out," she said.
"You get out of them clothes. Here, sit down."
She guided him to a sofa and began trying to undo the laces of his shoes. The boy stood about uneasily, wondering what he was supposed to do. She got the man's shoes off and his socks. Now she was unfastening the belt. He just sat there, quiet and unresisting, as if engaged in some deep speculation. She kept saying,
"Damn you, damn you,"
in a tone of despair and solicitude at once. She was pulling his trousers off. The boy began to look about him wildly.
"What are you doing?"
the man said in mock indignity.
"You raise up, damn you."
"Here," he said.
"I'm in no shape for this kind of carrying on." Mary and Silder, I'm not putting up with your foolishness, you hear me? Now you get out of them britches, and get out of them now, and quick. God rest your poor mother, I don't know why she ain't dead either, putting up with you long as she did. Lift your feet. Here, wait. I'll get you some shoes, too.
She disappeared through a door, and the man winked hugely at him, sitting there with his trousers in a pile under his feet. She came back and dumped some clothes into his lap. Then she saw the great bruise on the side of his calf, livid in hues of red and purple against the bare white of his naked legs. She knelt and touched it, whimpering softly. She went out again and returned with a basin of water and a cloth and bathed it carefully, the man crying out from time to time in simulated anguish. But she didn't cuss him any more. When she finished, she turned to the boy.
"What about you?"
she said.
"Yes'm."
"Yes'm." She looked from him to the man and back.
"You going to die standing there, I reckon, yes'm."
She narrowed her eyes at him.
"Start shucking," she said.
"What?" The man on the couch giggled. He was pulling on a clean shirt.
"Here,"
she said.
"Go in yonder."
She pointed behind her.
"I'll get you some clothes in just a minute."
He started past her with strange sluicing sounds.
"Empty them boots first," she told him.
He stopped.
"Outside."
He said yes'm again, went to the door and returned, one sock on and one off, leaving odd, unmatched tracks on the raw pine flooring. The door she pointed him through led to a bedroom. There was a fireplace with a coal grate and a faint warmth still issuing from it. He stood in front of it on a small hooked rug for a minute, then softly eased the door to.
"Get that blanket,"
the woman called to him. He peeled off his wet clothes, piling them on top of the mackinaw which he had laid carefully on the floor, took the rolled blanket from the foot of the bed, and wrapped himself in it. He was standing at the window, looking out at the gray morning, when she came in with the shirt and pants and handed them to him. Then she scooped his things off the floor and went out. He unfolded himself out of the blanket and got into the dry clothes. There was a pair of army socks, too, and he put these on and sat on the bed, wondering if it was all right to walk on the floor with them. She didn't bring any shoes, though, and after a while he ventured out into the front room again. The man was dressed, his head bandaged, and he was sitting with his feet in a pan of water and reading a magazine. He looked up and saw the boy standing there in the drooping shirt and the trousers turned up at the bottoms and gathered at the waist by the expedient of fastening the front buttonhole to a suspender button on the side.
"They ain't much of a fit, are they?"
the man said.
"No, sir."
"Marion."
"What?"
"Marion. Silder. That's my name, Marion Silder."
"Oh,"
he said. "Pleased to meet you."
"Yes, sir."
"Well," the man said, "get you a chair." He pulled up a cane rocker from beside the stove, sat quietly with his hands on his knees. The man leaned back on the sofa, a huge, shapeless affair, draped with a flower print cover. Behind him on the wall, in an oval frame, hung a picture of him and the woman, the wife, peering out upon the room with tentative and uncertain smiles. There were small rugs scattered about the floor, some pieces of furniture, a sideboard, a table and chairs. On a small cabinet in one corner stood a walnut trophy with a small bronze automobile perched on top of it.
"You know what was in the car?"
The boy looked back at him.
"Yes, sir."
"Marion." "Well," the man said. He returned to his magazine, leafed a page over slowly, looked back at the boy. He grinned.
"It was good stuff, too," he said. 60 gallons of it."
Then the woman called them to breakfast, and he put down the magazine and reached for a towel to dry his feet with. The boy noticed that part of the big toe was missing from the man's left foot. It was nailless, curious-looking, sort of like a nose. The man eased his slippers on and stood up, supporting himself on the couch. "Come on," he said, "let's eat some," and hopped off to the kitchen. The boy followed. They sat down to a breakfast of eggs and grits, biscuits and pork tenderloin, and huge cups of coffee. The coffee was black and bitter, and there was no milk or sugar on the table. The boy sipped it slowly, watched the man. The woman didn't eat with them. She hovered about the edge of the table, resupplying eggs and biscuits to their plates, filling their cups. The man didn't say anything until he had finished, except that from time to time he would nudge a plate toward the boy and frown and grunt, urging him to eat. He finished off with biscuits and dark honey and got up from the table. In a few minutes he was back with coats and boots and handed a set to the boy. "Come on," he said. "I got something to show you might like." The boy pulled on the coat and stepped into the cavernous brogans, and they went out the kitchen door into the new morning, the air clear and cold as spring water, shreds of mist lifting off the mountain above them and light pouring through the gap like a mill race. The man hobbled ahead of him to a smokehouse where he pulled a bent nail from the wood and swung out the door, hinge, hasp, block, and all, and went in. "Come on," he said. The boy followed him into the musty gloom. "Hello, gal," the man said. The air was rife and fetid with dog smells, sounds of snuffling, thin mewlings from somewhere in the corner. A small hound poked her face around the man's knee and looked up at him. "This here's Lady," the man said. Lady sniffed at his billowing trousers. He could see now. A broken lantern swung from a beam, a clutter of tools, a grindstone, an anvil fashioned from a section of rail. The man was squatting in the corner, the hound skidding nervously behind his back, poking her nose under his arm. She got around him and settled in a pile of croaker sacks, and he could see the puppies then, too, over the man's shoulder. They crawled over each other and fell to nursing. Lady blinked her mild hound eyes and gazed at the roof. The man picked out one and handed it to him. He took it, the fat, slick little belly filling his palm, legs dangling. Took it and looked at the quiet and already sad eyes, the pushed-in puppy face with the foolish ears. 4 weeks old, the man was saying. "That's the best one, but you can pick whichever one you want." "Do what?" "His daddy's a blooded blue tick. Half blue tick, half walker, the pups. Makes as good a tree dog as they is going. You like that one?" "Yes, sir," he said. "Well, he's yourn then. You can take him home with you in about another month, say." Jefferson Gifford thumbed his galluses onto his shoulders, took a last swallow of coffee from the still full earthenware cup, and crossed with heavy boot tread the curling linoleum of the kitchen floor to the rear entranceway, where he took down his hat and jacket from a peg. "A Plymouth," he repeated. Legwater was buttoning his coat. "That's what he said. I ain't been down there. All I know is he said it was a Plymouth. He come straight to my place on account of it was on his milk route, and he asked for me to call you. So I just come on over. He said it was a Plymouth." Gifford adjusted his hat and opened the door. "Well, come on," he said. "I sure never heard of nobody hauling whiskey in a Plymouth." "Ain't you going to call the sheriff?" "Reckon I'll see what all it is I'm calling him about first," Gifford said. They parked the car just beyond the creek and climbed through the wire fence and walked along slow, studying the swath the car had cut through the brush and small trees. It had cleared the fence completely, peeling a limb from a cottonwood that grew by the bridge and come to earth some 30 feet from the road. It was upside down in the creek against the far bank and facing back the way it came. Gifford couldn't see anything yet but the undercarriage, but he knew it wasn't a Ford this time by the 2 semi-elliptic springs at the rear axle. They had to go back to the road and cross the bridge to get to the car. It was smashed up against some roots on the bank, and they could see the glass leaking from the trunk lid. Later, when they got a truck down and winched the wreck out, the lid fell off and glass poured into the creek. Someone said later for 30 minutes. For a long time, anyway. There were even 2 or 3 jars unbroken, which pleased Gifford. Evidence, he said. It was a Plymouth, a 33 coupe. There was a hole in the right front tire you could put 3 fingers in. Other than that, there was nothing remarkable about it, except that it was wrecked in Red Branch with the remains of a load of whiskey in the back end. Gifford examined the ground carefully, walking back and forth along the bank, as if he had lost something there. He had written the license number down on a slip of paper, but on looking closer, saw that they were last year's plates repainted and threw the paper away in disgust. "Looks to me like he'd have been hurt," Legwater was saying. "They." "They what?" "Them," Gifford said. "They's 2 of 'em." "You mean tracks?" "Them's most likely Oliver's. He come down to see was they anybody hurt. Except he never clumb down into the creek to... See? Here." Gifford paused, staring at the ground. After a long minute, he looked up at Legwater. "Earl," he said, "I reckon you're right." "Figured I was." "Yep. The other 'un wasn't in the car. He just come along and got whoever was in out." "It wasn't Oliver," Legwater persisted. "He never even seen nobody around when he come by. He..." "Ain't talking about him," the constable said. "Come on if you're ready." It had begun to rain a little by then. "Believe it may warm up for a spell," Gifford said, "if it don't turn snow." In the store the old men gathered, occupying for endless hours the creaking milk cases, speaking slowly and with conviction upon matters of profound inconsequence, eyeing the dull red bulb of the stove with their watery vision. Shrouded in their dark coats, they had a vulturous look about them, their faces wasted and thin, their skin dry and papery as a lizard's. John Shell, looking like nothing so much as an ill-assembled mannequin of bones on which clothes were hung in saggy, dusty folds, his wrists protruding like weathered sticks from his flapping prelate sleeves. John Shell unhinged his toothless jaw with effort, a slight audible creaking sound to speak his one pronouncement. "It ain't so much that as it is one thing and another." An assemblage of nods to this. In the glass cases, roaches scuttled, a dry rattling sound as they traversed the candy in broken ranks, scaled the glass with licoriced feet, their segmented bellies yellow and flat. Summer and winter they patrolled the candy case, inspected handkerchiefs, socks, cigars. Occasionally, too, they invaded the meat case, a medicinal white affair rusted from sweat where the lower edge of the glass was mortised, so that brown stains like tobacco spit or worse seeped down the enamel, but they soon perished here from the cold. Their corpses lay in attitudes of repose all along the little scupper to the front of the case. Leaning against the case, John Wesley could see the car pull in alongside the rusty orange gas pump and the two men get out. When they came through the door, the nasal clacking voices paused, the chorus of elders looking up, down, back to the stove. Some fumbled knives from their overalls and fell to whittling idly on their milk cases. John Shell struggled to his feet, opened the stove door with kerchiefed hand, dropped in a small chunk of coal from the hod. A draft of sparks scurried upwards. He spat assertively at them and clanked the loose iron door closed. The two men crossed to the dope box in close order, on the raw subflooring, their steps heavy and martial. They selected their drinks, and the taller man came over to the counter and spun down a dime. The other one closed the lid and hiked himself up on the box, where he sat taking little sips of his drink and smirking strangely at the old men. John Shell turned to the man at the counter and said, "Howdy, Giff." "Howdy," said Gifford, nodding in general to the group. He took a drink of his dope. Mr. Eller came from his chair by the meat block and rang up the dime. Gifford said howdy to him, too, and he grunted and went back to his chair, taking with him a newspaper from the counter. "Warming up," Gifford said. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a cold wind feathered the red water puddles in front of the store. He tilted his head and drank again. A fly rattled electrically against the front window. The fire cricked and moaned in the stove. Gifford hoisted his dope to eye level, examined it, his mouth pursed about the unswallowed liquid, swirling the bottle slowly, studying viscosity and bead, suspicious of foreign matter. In the folds of flesh beneath his chin, his Adam's apple rose and fell. "See where somebody lost an old Plymouth down in the crick," he said. A few looked up. "That a fact?" someone said. "Yes, sir," said Gifford. "Seems a shame." Legwater, the county humane officer, finished now with his drink, sat leaning forward, hands palm downward, sitting on his fingers, an attitude toad-like but for his thinness and the spindle legs dangling over the side of the box. He was swinging them out, banging his heels against the drink case. A long-legged and emaciated toad, then. He kept leering and smirking, but no one paid him any attention. Most of the old men had been there the day he shot 2 dogs behind the store with a .22 rifle, one of them 7 times, it screaming and dragging itself along the fence in the field below the forks, while a cluster of children stood watching until they, too, began screaming. He said, "Sure does," brightly, enjoying himself. Gifford passed him a sharp glance sideways, and he hushed and fell to watching his heels bounce. "I don't reckon nobody knows whose car that is, do they?" Gifford went on. A few of the elders seemed to be dozing. The fly buzzed at the glass. "I got a tow truck coming to take it on into town. Sure would like to get that car to the rightful owner." "What kind of car did you say it was?" It was the boy leaning against the meat case who spoke. Giff drained the last of his dope with studied indifference, set the bottle carefully on the counter. He looked at the boy, then he looked at the boy's feet. "You always wear them slippers, son?" The boy didn't look down. He started to answer, but he could feel the cords in his throat sticking. He coughed and cleared his throat noisily. His feet felt huge. "Them ain't enough shoes for wet weather," Gifford said. Then he was moving across the floor. Legwater eased himself down from the drink box and fell in behind him. At the door, Giff stopped, the door half open, studying something obliquely overhead. "Yes, sir," he said. "Looks like it's fixin' to clear off." Legwater hovered behind him like some dark and ominous bird. "Well, we'll see," Gifford said. By the meat block, Mr. Eller dozed with his paper. He had not looked up, nor did he now. "Come back," he said. And they were gone. The fly rattled again at the window. The congress of ancients about the stove stirred one by one. The boy stood uneasily by the meat case. Some of the old men were rolling smokes with their brown, papery hands. It was very quiet. He went to the door and stood there for a while. Then he left. Her first high yelp was thin and clear as the air itself, its tenuous and diminishing echoes sounding out the coves and hollows, to a high ring like the last fading note of a chime glass. He could hear the boy breathing in the darkness at his elbow, trying to breathe quietly, listening too hard. She sounded again, and he stood and touched the boy's shoulder lightly. "Let's go," he said. The strung-out, ringing yelps came like rifle fire. The boy was on his feet. "Has she treed yet?" he asked. "No, she's just hit it now." Then he added, "She's close, though, hot." He started down the steep hummock on which they had been resting, through a maze of small pines whose polished needles thick on the ground made the descent a series of precarious slides from trunk to trunk, until they got to the gully at the bottom, a black slash in the earth beyond which he could see nothing, although he knew there was a field there, pitched sharply down to the creek some 100 yards further on. He dropped into the gully, heard the beaded rush of sliding dirt as the boy followed, came up the other side, and started out through the field at a jog trot, the heavy weeds popping and his corduroys setting up a rhythmic zip-zip as he ran. The cottonwoods at the creek loomed up stark and pale out of the darkness. He crossed a low wreck of barbed wire, heard again the resonant creak of the rusty staples in the checked and split cedar post as the boy crossed behind him. They were in the woods above the creek then, rattling through the stiff frosted leaves. Lady's sharp trail call still broke excitedly off to their right. They moved out under the dark trees, through a stand of young cedars gathered in a clearing, vespertine figures, rotund and druidical in their black solemnity. When the man reached the far side, the woods again, he stopped and the boy caught up with him. "Which way is she going?" He was trying not to sound winded. The man paused for just a moment more. Then he said, "Same way he is," motioning loosely with his hand. His back melted into the darkness again. The boy moved after him, keeping his feet high, following the sound of the brittle leaves. Their path angled down toward the creek, and he could hear at intervals the rush of water, high now after the rain, like the rumble of a distant freight passing. "Watch a log," the man called back to him. He jumped just in time, half-stumbled over the windfall trunk, lost his balance, ricocheted off a sapling, went on, holding his head low, straining to see. Trees appeared, slid past with slow gravity before folding again into the murk beyond. They were climbing now, a long rise, and when he came over the crest, he caught a glimpse of the figure ahead of him, framed darkly for an instant against a glaucous drop of sky. Below him he could make out the course of the creek. They dipped into a low saddle in the ridge, rose again, and the man was no longer there. He stopped and listened. Lady's clear voice was joined by another, lower and less insistent. She was much closer now, quartering down, coming closer. He could follow her progress, listening between the explosions of his breath. Then she stopped. There was a moment of silence, then the other dog yapped once, sounds of brush crashing. 2 wild yelps just off to his right, and then a concussion of water. A low voice at his side said, "He's got her in the creek, come on." The man started down the side of the hill, the boy behind him, and out onto a small flat set in the final slope to the creek and dominated by a thick beech tree. Something was coming down from the ridge above them, and they halted. A long shadow swept past in a skitter of leaves and on toward the creek bank. There was one short chopped bark, and then a splash. They followed, sidling down the slope and out along the bank where the water gathered a thin membranous light, by which they could see, directed by frantic surging sounds and low intermittent growls, some suggestion of figures struggling there, and the new dog striking out in the water now to join them. The fight moved down, out in deep water and under the shadow of the far bank. The snarls stopped, and there was only the desperate rending of water. A light blinked through the trees to their right, went out, appeared again, bobbing, unattached and eerie in the blackness. They could hear the dry, frosted crack of sticks and brush, muted voices. The light darted out, peered again suddenly down upon them, sweeping an arc along the edge of the creek. "Howdy," a voice said. "Cass? Yeah. That you, Marion? Bring that light. They're in the creek." They came down the slope, 4 dismembered legs hobbling in the swatch of light as they descended. "Throw your light," Silder said. They came alongside, dispensing an aura of pipe smoke and dog hair. The shorter one was working the beam slowly over the creek. "Whereabouts?" he said. "Down some. Howdy, Bill." "Howdy," the other said. In the glare emanating from the flashlight, their breath was smoke-white, curling, clinging about their heads in a vaporous canopy. The oval of the flash beam scudded down the glides against the far bank, passed, backed, came to rest on the combatants clinching in the icy water, the coon's eyes glowing red, pinpoints, his fur wetly bedraggled and his tail swaying in crestfallen buoyancy on the current. The big dog was circling him warily, trudging the water with wearying paws and failing enthusiasm. They could see Lady's ears sticking out from under the coon's front leg, and then her hindquarters bobbed up, surging through the face of the creek with a wild flash of tail and sinking back in a soundless swirl. Cass swung the beam to shore, scrabbled up a handful of rock, and handed the light to the other man. "Hold it on him," he said. He scaled a rock at the coon. It cut a slow arc in the beam and pitched from sight with a muffled slurp. The big hound started for shore, and Lady's tail had made another desperate appearance, when the second rock, a flitting shadow, curving, flashed water under the coon's face. He turned loose and struck out downstream, stroking with the current. The big dog on the other bank now had set up a pitiful moaning sound, pacing, the man with the light calling to him in a hoarse and urgent voice. "Hunt him up, boy, hunt him up." He turned to the men. "He's scared of rocks," he explained. "Hush a minute," Silder said, taking the light from him. She was already some 30 yards below them. When the light hit her, she turned her head back, and her eyes came pale orange, ears fanned out and floating, treading the water down before her with a tired and grim determination. She had her mouth turned up at the corners in a macabre and ludicrous grin as if to keep out the water. "Ho, gal," Silder called. "Ho, gal." They were moving down the creek, too, raking through the brush. "She's fixin' to drown herself," someone said. "Ho, gal, ho." He never even felt the water. He couldn't hear them anymore, hadn't heard them call since he left them somewhere back up the creek when he hit the bullbriars full tilt, not feeling them either, aware only of them pulling at his coat and legs like small hands, trying to hold him. Then he was over the bank, feet reaching for something and finally skewing on the slick mud, catapulting him in a stiff-legged parabola down and out into the water, arms flailing but not falling yet, not until he had already stopped, teetering thigh-deep, and took a first step out into the current where he collapsed forward like a shot heron. But he didn't even feel it. When he came up again, he was in water past his waist, the soft creek floor squirming away beneath his feet as if he were walking the bodies of a colony of underwater creatures clustered there. He could see a little better now. There was no light on the bank, and he thought, "I come down too far." And no voices, only the sounds of the creek chattering and rocking past all around him. Then he went in again, over his head this time, and came up treading water and with something heavy pushing against his chest. He got his arms under it and lifted. Lady's head came up, and her eyes rolled at him dumbly. He reached and got hold of her collar, the creek bottom coming up and sliding off under his feet, falling backwards now with the dog rolling over him and beginning to struggle, until his leg hit a rock and he reached for it and steadied himself, and rose again and began to flounder shoreward with the dog in tow. They came with the light, and Silder looked at him huddled in the willows, still holding the dog. He didn't say anything, just disappeared into the woods, returning in a few minutes with a pile of brush and dead limbs. One of the men was kneeling with him and stroking the dog, examining her. "She looks all right," he said. "Don't she, son?" He couldn't get his mouth open, so he just nodded. He was beyond cold now, paralyzed. The other man said, "Son, you going to take your death. We better get you home before you freeze setting right there." He nodded again. He wanted to get up, but he couldn't bear the rub of his clothes where he moved. Silder had the fire going by then, a great crackling sound as the dry brush took, orange light leaping among the trees. He could see him in silhouette moving about, feeding the blaze. Then he came back. He gathered the quivering hound up in one arm and motioned for the boy to follow. "You come over here," he said, and get them clothes off." He got up then and labored stiffly after them. Silder put the hound by the fire and turned to the boy. "Let me have that coat," he said. The boy peeled off the leaden mackinaw and handed it over to him. He passed it around the trunk of a sapling, gathered the ends up in his hands, and twisted what looked to be a gallon of water out of the loose wool. Then he hung it over a bush. When he looked back, the boy was still standing there. "Get 'em off," he said. He started pulling his clothes off, the man taking from him in turn shirt and trousers, socks and drawers, wringing them out and hanging them over a pole propped on forks before the fire. When he was finished, he stood naked, white as a slug in the cup of firelight. Silder took off his coat and threw it to him. "Put it on," he said, "and get your ass over here in front of the fire." The two men were behind him in the woods. He could hear them crashing about, see the wink of their light. One of them came back toting a huge log and dropped it on the fire. A flurry of sparks ascended, flared, lost in the smoke, pulling at the bare limbs overhead, returned, tracing their slow fall redly through the dark trees downwind. He sat in a trampled matting of vines, the long coat just covering his buttocks. Silder made a final adjustment to the pole and came over. He lit a cigarette and stood regarding him. "Kind of cool, ain't it?" he said. The boy looked up at him. "Cool enough," he said. The clothes had begun to steam, looking like some esoteric game, quartered and smoking on the spit. Then he said, "What did you do with the coon?" "Coon?" "Yeah, the coon." "Goddamn," the boy said. "I never saw the coon." "Oh," Silder said. But his voice was giving him away. "Hell, I figured you'd have got the coon, too." "Shoo," the boy said. Over his teeth the firelight rippled and danced. The two men were warming their hands at the fire, the shorter one grinning good-naturedly at the boy. The other hound had appeared, hovering suddenly at the rim of light and snuffling at the steaming wool and then slouching past them with nervous indifference, the slack hound Grace, to where Lady lay quietly peering across her paws into the fire. He nosed at her, and she raised her head to look at him with her sad red eyes. He stood so for a minute, looking past her, then stepped neatly over her and melted silently into the black wickerwork of the brush. The other man moved over to her and reached down to pat her head. One ear was mangled and crusting with blood. "Coon's hard on a walker," he said. "Walker's got too much heart. Old Redbone like that." He motioned toward the blackness that encircled them. "He'll quit if it gets too rough. Little old Walker, though." He addressed the dog now. "She just got too much heart, ain't she?" When Silder let him out of the car, his clothes were still wet. "You better scoot in there fast," he told him. "Your ma raise hell with you?" "No," he said. "She'll be asleep." "Well," Silder said, "we'll go again. You got to stay out of the crick, though. Here, I got to get on. My old lady'll be standing straight up." "All right, we'll see you." He let the door fall. "Night," Silder said. The car pulled away, trailing ropey plumes of smoke, the one red taillight bobbing. He turned toward the house, lifeless and archaic among the crumbling oaks, crossed the frosted yard. His shadow swept upward to the lean-to roof, dangled from a limb, upward again, laced with branches, stood suddenly upon the roof. He slid downward over the eaves and disappeared in the black square of the gable window.